So thank you for having me. So that's one thing that I like about this. Can I tell you a couple things that I don't like? One is talking about myself, and two is being the center of attention. So here I am talking about myself, being the center of attention. The ironic thing is I like to hear other people's life stories. In our church, one of my favorite things is when people share their testimony and about like what God is currently doing in their life. And I realize I like to hear the testimony of others because generally it's like a good story. Like there's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. And the beginning is usually setting up the scene of their life and maybe how their life started. The middle usually has some kind of a conflict, and then the end has that happy ending, right? It's like a perfect Disney movie. When Pastor Matt asked me if I would share, I was hesitant. And the reason I was hesitant is because currently my story doesn't have a happy ending. I am in what I hope is the middle. I'm struggling. I'm struggling to trust God's goodness. I'm struggling to grow in my faith. And I feel like no one wants to watch a Disney movie without a happy ending. And the same feels true about sharing my testimony this morning. As I thought about this, though, I think the reason that I'm sometimes embarrassed or ashamed of my testimony is I falsely believe that the things that happen in my life are in some way my fault. In 2 Timothy 1, verses 8 and 9, Paul is writing to Timothy, and Paul is in prison, and he says, "Therefore do not be ashamed of the testimony about our Lord, nor of me his prisoner, but share in suffering for the gospel by the power of God, who saved us and called us to a holy calling, not because of our works, but because of his own purpose and grace, which he gave us in Christ Jesus before the ages began." I should not be ashamed of my testimony because the truth is, it's not mine. It's really God's. It's happening to me, but ultimately it is about God. So I hope that by sharing with you today, I can bring glory to God and maybe encourage you in the middle of your story, because no matter your age this morning, you're in the middle. Because the end is when we die and we get to go be with Christ. That's the happy ending if you're a believer. So no matter your story, it will have a happy ending. So thank you for letting me share. I grew up in a faithful Christian home. We were in church every time the doors were open. The church I grew up in was very conservative, and a lot of emphasis was put on following the Bible and God's rules. I didn't have a lot of teaching or training about like a personal relationship with God. It was really more about following those rules, and that God really only cared about whether I followed his rules. And I always got the impression that God was waiting to hand out consequences for every time that I did not. My pastor at my church likes to describe it as like the whack-a-mole game. Do you know that game? You know, where they're like popping up and you've got the mallet and you're like hitting them down. That's really how I felt growing up. I felt like I had to be on my best behavior because anytime I did something wrong, like I was going to pop up and God was waiting there just to like whack me back down. At the age of 10, I attended a week of summer camp, and on Wednesday night of that week, the chapel speaker spoke about how even though I was working hard to follow all of the rules and attend church, it wasn't enough. He said something specific that I'll never forget. He said, "Your grandparents and parents are not going to be waiting at the gates of heaven to vouch for you. They're not going to say, 'She's with us.'" It needed to be a personal relationship. So with the help of my camp counselor, I made a profession of faith that night. And I still didn't understand what a personal relationship with God was at that point, but I was starting to understand that God wanted more from me than just perfect attendance and good works. Let's fast forward. About 8 years later, same camp, except this time I was working as a camp staff. That summer, I met my future husband, Jim, and we got married 2 years later. And 3 years after that, our oldest daughter was born. And then 3 sons, for a total of 4 children in 4.5 years. When our oldest son was 2 years old, we began to notice he wasn't meeting typical milestones, and he was eventually diagnosed with autism. If you're not familiar with autism, it's a neurological disorder that impacts the normal development of the brain in areas of social interaction, communication skills, and cognitive function. We did not know at the time. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have Google. We couldn't search anything. We just had to rely on what we were being told by the professionals. So we didn't know at the time that autism was a spectrum disorder, meaning it can vary in severity from person to person. The information we were being given at the time was discouraging, to say the least. Of course, we were sad and we were disappointed, but I distinctly remember thinking, I've had a really easy life. Every Christian has to have something, right? Like we have to have something hard. If this is our hard, we can make this work. This is doable. We can make this work. A year later, our second son was also diagnosed with autism. And the effects of autism made it very difficult to go out in public or even attend church. The inability to communicate wants and needs verbally often led to long and loud tantrums. Autism also affected their ability to recognize danger. So they would often try to play in the road or even jump off two-story decks because they were convinced that they could fly like the cartoon that they watched. Sounds, smells, texture of clothing would cause sensory overload, resulting in meltdowns. It was exhausting and it was overwhelming. How could God do this to us twice? Weren't we already being tested enough? As I wrestled with these thoughts, I distinctly remember nursing our youngest. He was 6 months old at the time. His name is Brady. And I remember begging God to please spare him from having autism. That was it. That was like the only thing I could think of to ask for was like, please spare him from having autism. I can't do this a third time. If you're not familiar with autism, a lot of time the signs of it are often evident before the age of 2. When Brady was 22 months old, just 2 months shy of his second birthday, I began to breathe a sigh of relief because he was meeting all of his milestones. In fact, he was probably a little bit ahead. He was talking, he was verbally communicating without any indication of a problem. And at the same time, I began to think that he might be sick. I thought maybe he had a virus or something because he was drinking a lot of water and he seemed to have lost a little bit of weight. So I just on a whim called our pediatrician and they said, yep, bring him in. So we brought him in and he was quickly diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. We had no idea what that meant. I don't know. I didn't know anything about type 1 diabetes. I didn't know anything about diabetes. I thought you got diabetes because you ate too much sugar. I thought, how can my 22-month-old have diabetes? He doesn't get any sugar, maybe birthday cake or something like that, but we're not giving him any sugar. What we found out is type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disorder. It means that the body is basically attacking itself. It attacks the cells in the pancreas and basically causes the pancreas to stop producing insulin. Insulin is needed to live, and insulin is like a key that unlocks the door to allow sugar to leave your bloodstream. Without that key, it will build up in your bloodstream and it will eventually kill you. We were immediately sent to an 8-hour class where we were taught how to give insulin injections and, frankly, how to keep him alive. I, to put it frankly, was devastated. How could God afflict all 3 of our boys with difficult things? It felt like we were being given more than our fair share. In the early years of our marriage, Jim and I had both believed God called us to do some form of ministry. In fact, we'd both gone to Bible college, and Jim had been a youth pastor for a while. When Brady was diagnosed, Jim was working for an engineering firm, but we still believed we were meant to be in some form of ministry again in the future. I was upset. I was upset that God would call us to ministry and then give us these difficult things, because how in the world are we supposed to minister to others when we're barely keeping our head above water in our own family? I kind of gave up on that. I kind of felt like, okay, maybe we were wrong. Maybe ministry was like for a short time, and now we have all of these special needs in our home, and we need to really focus on that. A few months after Brady was diagnosed with diabetes, the engineering firm that Jim worked for downsized significantly, and they closed their West Michigan location, thus leaving us unemployed. This was the beginning of God orchestrating things to push us back into ministry. The camp where we met, which is Lincoln Lake, and where I grew up attending since the age of 8, was without a director for the summer. So the camp board knew that Jim was unemployed, and they asked if he could fill in as a temporary director for the summer. At the end of that summer, Jim was offered the executive director position. It had been our dream to minister at this camp that had so profoundly impacted us. And little did we know that God was preparing us through the experiences with our boys to be more compassionate towards kids with special needs. We added special needs training to our counseling training sessions and eventually expanded to include trauma training as well. We were determined to make camp as accessible as possible for kids that might not otherwise have the opportunity to attend camp. In 2011, baby number 5, a boy we named Cyrus, was born. The advantage to having our first 4 kids in 4.5 years is that they always had a playmate. Well, there was over a 4-year gap between that group, and then we had this little tag along, Cyrus. And it just felt awkward. It felt empty. It felt like something needed to fill in that gap. Before we had gotten married, we had talked about adoption, but we had never really seriously pursued it. We just knew that we were open to the idea. I grew up in a home where my parents did foster care for over 30 years, so I was familiar with the need, but I just wasn't really sure how it would fit into our family. It felt a little crazy, but we decided to take the first step of filling out paperwork, which led to the next step of taking classes, which led to the next step of deciding how many children we were willing to adopt. We were told that because of the limit of 6 kids in a home, and we already had 5 biological, we would only be allowed to adopt 1 child. Well, that was not what we felt God calling us to do. So even though the social worker tried to dissuade us from writing anything contrary to the rules on paper, we didn't listen. We specifically wrote that we were willing to adopt 3 children under the age of 7. I don't remember why exactly we chose under the age of 7. I think it was because our oldest son was 7, our oldest daughter was 8, and I think at that time we thought, well, let's try to keep them in their birth order, and then we'll just kind of squeeze everybody else in. So we went ahead and wrote that down. We would take 3 children under the age of 7. A year into the adoption process, diabetes struck again. Our daughter Josie was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes during the week of her 12th birthday. And our son Brady had already had diabetes for 5 years at that point, and we knew how brutal that disease can be and had experienced the emotional toll it took. I was broken for her, and I began to doubt whether we should continue to pursue adoption. Why would God ask us to adopt and yet continue to give us hard things? Hadn't He tested us enough? Maybe we misunderstood God. Maybe we were only being asked to show we were willing. Maybe we were supposed to be like Abraham, getting ready to sacrifice his son Isaac on the altar. Maybe God was going to see if we were obedient enough to walk through all the steps, and then like Abraham binding Isaac and putting him on the altar, God would say, okay, you can stop now. Thank you for showing me you're obedient, but you can stop. Our paperwork, classes, and home study were done, but that was probably about as far as God would allow it to go. At least that's what I was convinced was going to happen. I even remember telling the social worker that was helping us with our adoption process that our daughter had recently been diagnosed, and I remember thinking specifically she's going to say, oh, that's okay. You guys don't have to pursue this anymore. You can be done. You've got enough on your plate. A year after Josie's diagnosis and 2 years after starting the adoption process, we received an email asking if we would consider adopting a sibling group of 3 children, ages 2, 3, and 6. 3 children under the age of 7, exactly what we had written on our application. I don't know how you can confirm God's calling more than that. When God is so specific, you can't say no. After fostering the kids for a year, we were able to finalize their adoption and officially make them a part of our family. Adoption was, and still is, a stretching experience for everyone involved. We have been a family of 10 for over 4 years now, but we are still struggling at times to adjust. Adoption comes with a lot of emotions. Some feel good, and others feel less good. Adoption always starts from brokenness. Anytime someone, even a baby given up at birth, is adopted, it starts with a separation from their biological family. And that brokenness can heal, but it always leaves a scar. Sometimes the scar is very faint and barely even noticeable. Other times the scar is large and deep and it is very obvious. We are still in the midst of helping our children process the trauma they have experienced. And it can be very hard at times, but also very rewarding. I'm going to go off on a little rabbit trail. If you are in any way feeling a prompt from God to get involved in any type of adoption, foster care, anything of that, do it. It is hard, but it is so worth it. So worth it. Okay, let's fast forward a little bit. 1 year ago in October, we received a letter stating that our insurance would no longer cover the insulin prescribed for our 2 kids with diabetes. This was concerning because, like I said, insulin is not optional. In January, I appealed the decision with our insurance company, but we were still denied. The insulin being offered in place of what they were using was not adequate for our needs, so I inquired about the cost of it at our local pharmacy, thinking I'll just purchase it with cash. I was told the cost would be $606 for a box that would last approximately 6 to 8 weeks. That was for 1 child. This was not something that we could make work within our budget, and as a result, we began rationing the 1 remaining covered prescription between the 2 kids. 3 weeks later, Cyrus, who was then 7, was complaining of feeling sick, and on a whim, I decided to check his blood sugar. When I put a drop of his blood in the meter, his blood sugar was so high it wouldn't even register a number on the meter. My heart dropped to the floor. I did not need a doctor or a hospital to tell me that my 3rd child now has type 1 diabetes. This diagnosis was the final straw for me, and I bottomed out. How could God do this to us again and again and again? I had researched the possibility of ordering insulin from Canada for 10% of the price before Cyrus was diagnosed, but I was waiting for the weather to warm up because I did not want to risk the insulin freezing in transport. Now we couldn't wait any longer. Without really having a plan, Jim, Cyrus, and I drove to the nearest Canadian border 2.5 hours away, and we found the nearest pharmacy. We walked in without a prescription and bought 12 boxes of insulin for $71 a box. I couldn't have orchestrated that. God orchestrated that. God knew that we were going to be denied this coverage. God knew how much it was going to cost. God knew how to make that way straight for us to go and purchase that insulin in Canada. There's no way I could have orchestrated that on my own. When I look back on this moment, I can see how even though I was anxious, I was overwhelmed and depressed, God was taking care of our needs. He made a way for us to get what we needed when we needed it. That experience of purchasing insulin from Canada led to a local news story, which led to a connection with a large community of people with type 1, which led to a bus trip to Canada to purchase more insulin with a presidential candidate, which led to a meeting with a congressman, and then a meeting with a U.S. senator. All of these things have allowed me to be a voice for not only my children, but a voice for thousands of others also struggling to get what they need to manage diabetes. All of these experiences have not changed our circumstances. What has changed and is still changing is my faith in God and who He is. If you'll allow me, I'm going to share with you a few things that I'm learning right now through this. I came across a quote from C.S. Lewis, and it says, "God has not been trying an experiment on my faith or love in order to find out their quality. He knew it already. It was I who didn't. He always knew that my temple was a house of cards. His only way of making me realize the fact was to knock it down." I feel like my house of cards was knocked down over and over and over. It was so tentative. When we got the 3rd diabetes diagnosis, I fell apart. I fell apart physically, I fell apart mentally and spiritually. Grief overwhelmed me, and I struggled to accept a 3rd diagnosis. I was embarrassed, and I was upset with myself for not having a stronger faith. If my faith were stronger, is what I told myself, I would not be having such a hard time accepting this in my life. When I told my pastor how upset I was and that I did not react with a stronger faith, he suggested that maybe the fact that I was upset about my lack of faith actually pointed to a bigger faith than I thought I possessed. The fact that I knew I needed God to bear this points to the fact that I believe God is the most necessary element in all of life's struggles. That's the foundation of faith. What I realized later, however, was that I was assuming that my grief and my emotional reaction meant I lacked faith. I thought a good Christian never feels angry, sad, or depressed. I thought feelings and emotions like this were sinful and not something a believer should feel. After all, doesn't James 1:2 say, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds"? I was not counting it as joy. The truth is that God made and gave us feelings and emotions. And if God made them, then in and of themselves, feelings and emotions are not bad. God also possesses feelings and emotions. Scripture gives many examples of God's emotions. I have a few here for you. Obviously, we know about God's love, but this is in Romans 5:8. But God shows his love for us, and that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. God also sometimes has a feeling of hate. The boastful shall not stand before your eyes. You hate all evildoers. Psalms 5:5. Anger. They provoked the Lord to anger with their deeds, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against his people, and he abhorred his heritage. Psalm 106:29 and verse 40. Joy. The Lord your God is in your midst, a victorious warrior. He will exult over you with joy. He will be quiet in his love. He will rejoice over you with shouts of joy. Zephaniah 3:17. The difference is God's emotions are perfect and always appropriate. Mine are not. The question I have to ask myself when I'm wrestling with my feelings is, are my feelings true in light of God's truth? Two of the feelings I've wrestled with most are grief and injustice. I grieve the loss of the carefree childhood that my children could have had. All of them. It's not fair that my children are facing all of these hard things. Are my feelings true in light of God's truth? In Romans 5:12 it says, "Therefore, just as sin came into the world through one man, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sinned." The things that grieve me and make me claim unfairness are consequences of sin. Not my sin or my children's sin directly, but the consequence of sin on the world as a whole. My feeling of injustice is not true. God is not being unfair or picking on me or my family. Sin affects all of us. In Genesis 6:6 it says, "And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart." God was grieved over Adam and Eve's choice. I don't think God's grief was a one-time thing, though. When God sees us suffering from the consequences of sin today, he still grieves for us. When I see my children suffering from the consequences of a fallen world, I grieve too. I think God grieved the loss of what could have been, and I feel the same loss at times too. The truth is, no one is exempt from the effects of sin, and as much as I want my children to not suffer as descendants of Adam, we all suffer the consequences, no matter how young or how old. A book that has been really helpful to me is "It's Not Supposed to Be This Way" by Lisa TerKeurst. There is a short prayer in there that I have been practicing and trying to really make a part of my life, and it's just one sentence, and it says, "Teach me to wrestle well between my faith and my feelings when life disappoints in ways I never imagined." I want to wrestle well. I want to wrestle well between my feelings and my faith, because they can go hand in hand as long as my feelings are true and they have truth with them. Another thing I'm learning right now is I mentioned earlier how I grew up in a church where obedience to God was emphasized over relationship with God. As a kid, I thought obeying God equaled an easy life. I obeyed God out of fear of retribution, and when our boys were diagnosed with autism, I was upset with God for giving us hard things because I thought that by being obedient, God would reward us with a fairly easy life. When hard things continued to happen, I tried bargaining with God by reminding him that we have been obedient by working in ministry and even following his prompting to adopt. God should give us smooth sailing in return. At least that's how I thought it worked. But God does not ask for obedience out of fear, but out of love. I have known verses about obeying God out of love practically my whole life. John 15:14 says, "You are my friends if you do what I command." John 14:21 says, "Whoever has my commands and keeps them is the one who loves me. The one who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I too will love them and show myself to them." But what I never considered until recently was God's love for me. I have always thought obedience was about my love for God, and it is. But even more than that, it's about God's love for me or you. You see, if I truly understand the depth of God's love for me, I will know that even though God is allowing something painful, he loves me, and he's only allowing what is good for me. He sees the bigger picture, and I can trust that because he loves me, he will only give me good things, even when they don't feel good. Nothing has brought this point home more to me recently than Cyrus's diabetes diagnosis. Even though Cyrus does not understand all the ramifications of having diabetes, the one thing he does understand is the physical pain that comes with it. But even though he tells us frequently how much he hates having diabetes, he is still enduring the pain of multiple injections and other physical problems because he knows that we love him. He trusts that we will only allow pain that is ultimately for his benefit. In John 15, verses 9 through 11, it says, "As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. These things have I spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be full." God does not want us to obey him because we're afraid of him. God wants us to obey him because of love. It's his love that leads to true joy, and even joy in the midst of pain. I came across a quote by Oswald Chambers recently from My Utmost for His Highest, and in the devotional he says, and I'm going to read this twice because it's so relevant to me right now. "Most of us collapse at the first grip of pain. We sit down at the door of God's purpose and enter a slow death through self-pity. And all the so-called Christian sympathy of others helps us to our deathbed. But God will not. He comes with the grip of the pierced hand of his Son, as if to say, 'Enter into fellowship with me, arise and shine.'" I'm going to read that one more time because that has been really profound for me recently. Most of us collapse at the first grip of pain. We sit down at the door of God's purpose and enter a slow death through self-pity. And all the so-called Christian sympathy of others helps us to our deathbed. But God will not. He comes with the grip of the pierced hand of his Son, as if to say, "Enter into fellowship with me, arise and shine." The pain Christ suffered on the cross was greater than any pain we will face on earth. Christ knows pain, and he is inviting us to join in fellowship with him in the midst of our pain. Will you join him?